Today we're reviewing the brand new 2022 Cannondale Scalpel HT. As you can see, I made a couple modifications. I upgraded the tires to a ground control grid 2.3 in the back and a specialized eliminator 2.3 up front. The stock Schwalbe tires are just too sketchy for where I live. It doesn't give me a good feeling to review the bike because the tires don't allow me to push the bike as hard as I need to. Those are very fast tires, they're very light tires, and they're great on softer dirt or less chunky stuff than we have, but they're not quite strong enough for what I need, and they don't quite have the grip that I need to push this bike to review it. I've also added a P&W Rainier post. It's a 125 mil drop. Unfortunately, the design of this doesn't let me run that lower, and it's hitting the top water bottle insert. Even though I removed the bolt, you can't push it down any further. So thankfully, P&W has this adjustable setting where I can change the height. So I'm going to lower it to a 100 mil dropper because it's too high as it is. So while this is dropper compatible, it's a little bit of a bummer because you're limited on 27.2 droppers, and I can't even fit a 125. That's a bummer. Also, it's not tube and tube, so I anticipate rattling. We'll see. That just means the cable's just floating around in there. It was pretty tricky to get through there, but I did get it through. These modifications added just under 2 pounds. It still came in at 23.78, which is still the lightest hardtail I've had on the channel, but it was sub 22 pounds with the lighter tires and the rigid post. Still, I am a huge fan of droppers, and to properly review this bike and properly ride it, I feel like a dropper is gonna let me do that a lot better than a rigid post. All right, let's hit the trail and see what this thing's all about. I'm excited for this thing. I'm excited for the Lefty Ocho carbon. I'm excited to be on the lightest hardtail I've been on ever, at least in the last 15 years. And I'm excited to see what modern XC race bikes feel like with more modern geometry. If you haven't seen the first look video of this, go check it out. I go over all the geometry and I actually measure it. This came in with a 67-degree head angle. This thing is light, and it's riding like a light bike. Light bikes get bounced around a little more jittery. You'll notice the super racy XC riding position it puts you in. With that long stem, that long negative rise stem, it really pulls you forward. You have a lot of weight on your hands. Here we go. Oh man, that's a rocket. That's a fast bike. This cockpit definitely takes some getting used to. It's pretty traditional XC race cockpit where you're hunched over the front. It's a real racy, aggressive attack position on blue and green stuff. But if you do get it on black diamonds, it's just downright scary. But this isn't meant for black diamonds. Wow, what a fast bike. Even with these heavier, meatier tires, they still roll fast and don't slow it down too much. I definitely feel over that front tire. This is a pure race bike through and through. It's not a lightweight trail bike. It has one purpose, and that's to win XC races. 110 mil Lefty Ocho carbon. Man, this accelerates so fast. Such a light bike. You never wheelie on this thing. The front wheel never lifts on the climbs because that stem puts your weight way out there and keeps the front down. Most racers can ride great without a dropper. They've adapted their technique. It's been so long since I've been without a dropper. I've come to rely on them. Yeah, it's not a playful ride. You're in attack position the whole time. It doesn't encourage you to manual or bunny hop or catch air. It encourages you to sneak in a few more pedals and speed up. That long stem puts a lot of weight on the front wheel, which means you have more traction than a lot of other bikes these days with slack head angles. It's funny, a lot of people are going shorter stems the slacker they go, and that puts even less weight on the front wheel. I'd be careful about going too short on your stem on your slack bike. So even when this fork is locked out, it still will give way if you hit a big jolt, so it won't blow it up and it won't destroy you. When you stand up and sprint, the fork does bob a little. That doesn't bother me because I'm not a racer. But if you're a racer, you'll want to hit that lockout button, get the most out of your energy. Doesn't feel quite as snappy on acceleration as my Spot rocker. Geo's very similar between those two. This stem and cockpit makes them feel totally different though. I'm gonna say the ride feel of this is even softer than the rocker. It's nice. The compliance that they claim to have built in seems to be working. Not beating me up. And that's such a tricky balance, balancing compliance with sprintability. You want good power transfer, stiff bottom bracket area. Oh, fun. This thing's a racer through and through. It totally reminds me of the way bikes sprinted in the 90s. And normally I don't love 175 mil cranks, but they're not bothering me on this. I think if I were racing XC, I'd probably be on 170s and maybe even 175s. I just love the power you can put down in a hard gear on those. I can already feel my lower back's not yet adjusted to this riding position. Take me a couple months to build up the muscles. You're really hunched over. But that's all XC race bikes. That's what they're like. And XC's races are won on the climbs, not the descents. So the idea is to make a bike that hangs well on the descents, but that climbs exceptionally well. So XC race bikes focus on the climbs, hence the negative rise stem, the long stem, longer cranks. Does not feel like a traditional trail hardtail. Man, that's fast uphill. That thing is quick. Really quick. These bars have very little back sweep. Everything about this bike says XC race. It wants to be ridden 10/10 as fast as it can all the time. A lot of people buy these XC race bikes because they're light, but they ride them at 4/10. And that's fine, you can do that. But these bikes really wake up when you sprint everywhere and just go as fast as you can. Yeah, I don't want a manual, I don't want to jump. I just want to stay on the ground, put the hammer down. Wow, we're cruising through here. This is my short little loop. We're almost done. I'm liking this little bike. It's very different from my Spot rocker. They're both very similar on the geo charts. They're pretty close to the same weight. They're both carbon. They're both meant to be zippy, fast, lightning fast hardtails on sprints. The Spot rocker is a little bit stiffer. It accelerates a little bit more aggressively. This is a little softer. I can definitely feel the flex they designed into the seat stays, and I really appreciate that. It's a zippy lightning bike. It's not quite as an on-off switch as that Spot is. That Spot, as soon as you sprint, it wants to just rocket forward. This does too, but it's a little bit tamer. Now we're gonna go up the hill and climb and see how it does on a long sustained climb. I'm sure it's gonna do fantastic. With the bars so far forward and low, it really weights the front wheel. So you don't have to slide so far forward on your saddle to keep the front wheel down. You can just kind of spin and put down the power. And that's what XC bikes are all about, is being in a climbing position where you can really just maximize every watt and just crush out that power. I'm glad I've got a dropper on it. Like I said, I'm not a racer. Hardtail Party is less about counting grams and watts and Strava times and more about having fun on the trail. But I'm very intrigued by XC race bikes, and I know a lot of you guys do race. So these bikes are very relevant to the discussion. but I am coming at it more from a trail riding perspective than a pure XC race riding perspective. But still, I see a lot of value in comparing it to how other hardtails ride. Compared to like a Specialized chisel, they're both comfortable frames. This one does feel a little bit more racy in the front with that longer stem, that flatter, wider bar. The chisel is just as soft as this, even though it's aluminum, but this just feels a little bit more like a performance race car than a daily driver that's also quick. Cannondale's really done their homework, and they've really designed this to be their flagship XC race bike. They're not trying to make it a trail bike. They're not trying to make it rowdy. They're not trying to make it good at everything. They're trying to make it the best at one thing. And it really does well at that one thing, sprinting and going uphill as fast as possible. But the new slack geometry works really well with this. It never felt sketchy or out of control on the downs and on the flow. But the riding position does take some getting used to if you're used to newer bikes. If you're used to older bikes or other XC race bikes, it's going to feel right at home. But if you're used to something a little more upright where you're not just hunched over and weighted on that front wheel, it's going to be a transition. But your body gets used to it pretty quick. Even by the end of my little loop, I was already clicking with it and I wasn't fighting it. It just did what I wanted it to do. I didn't have to do anything crazy with my technique or throw my weight around weird. I just rode and it responded really well. All right, let's go climb to the top, and then I'm going to make a couple tweaks to see what it might be like as more of a trail bike. This has a really nice build spec, and I know $6,000 is a lot for a hardtail, but for a flagship performance hardtail like this, I think the price is actually spot on. You got a full XT build with an XCR rear derailleur. I'm feeling that more traditional slacker seat tube. It cannot be overstated how light this bike is. On XC race bikes, weight is so important, especially weight at the wheels. And this bike is super light, and you feel it and notice it immediately. When sizing an XC bike compared to traditional trail bikes, you have to be careful and take stem length into account. This has a 423 mil reach, which is way shorter than any bike I ride. But because of that longer XC stem, it feels really roomy in the cockpit, really stretched out. I really like this Lefty Ocho. What a great little fork. All right, I'm not usually into lockouts on forks, but I'm gonna lock this out. It does give it a zippier feel. I think if I were racing, I would use the lockout. If it were my everyday trail bike, I wouldn't. I'd trade it for a dropper. But with how easy it is to activate with that little lever, it makes a lot of sense. With that fork locked out, it accelerates a little snappier, a little sharper than even the Spot rocker. You definitely feel the vibrations when it's locked out though. So it's best done on smooth or slower speed climby stuff like this. Yeah, that makes more of a difference than I thought it would. All right, Cannondale, you were right to put a locking fork on this. Everything about this riding position says climbing is of the essence. It puts your body in the best position to just maximize those leg muscles, to just crank away. Not the best technical climber, but it's not really meant to be. Yeah, you're very hunched over on this bike. Your hands are low and forward, and you're in attack position. And that's the difference between an XC race bike and a trail bike. Like I said, this is meant to win XC races, not meant to be the most comfortable, the most playful, the most fun, the most technical. It's built to be the fastest. This thing begs you to shift to a harder gear and just muscle through it till you're up to speed. This fork is every bit as torsionally stiff as a double fork, a traditional telescoping fork. Yeah, this riding position really takes some getting used to. It's been so long since I've been on an XC race bike. So I wanted to ride this as close to stock as I could. I had to add a dropper and the tires that I'm used to testing on, just so the tires didn't play into the review of the bike. If those Schwalbes are good for your terrain, it will be even faster, even more efficient, even peppier and zippier, but I know some of you are hoping I get experimental on this. I've gotten a little experimental with the dropper and the tires. In the comments of my first look video, some of you were asking if you could fit 2.4 or 2.5 inch tires on this. I think that's way overkill for what this bike is meant to do, but I like that you're curious and that you want to get experimental. So in the spirit of getting experimental and seeing if this could be made into a trail bike, I've gone and made a quick change. I put a 35 mil stem on here with a slight rise. So now, yeah, the controls still hit the top tube, but it's got a way shorter stem. We're gonna see if that makes it come alive and feel more like a trail bike, or if it's still gonna have that racy nature to it. All right, reach is noticeably shorter. It feels more like the traditional bikes I ride. I'm way less hunched over. Now the reach number's the same because reach is measured to the frame, not to the bars, but the bike feels way more compact. Still got that feel of a light bike where it's not as planted as a heavier bike. You know, lighter's not always better, especially in this chunky, bouncy stuff we got. Man, that frame's got a nice ride feel to it though. All right, we're gonna ride the same lap with this shorter stem, see if it wakes this bike up at all, or if it makes it sketchy. I'm not able to charge a whole lot harder yet. Just goes to show that bikes are so much more than one component. I almost think I prefer it with the longer stem as it was spec'd. My back prefers this. I'm way less hunched over. I think a 60 mil stem would be the sweet spot for me. A little more confident on the downs. And it still feels like an XC race bike. Even though it's got that 67-degree head angle, it feels very different from even my Spot rocker, which has a 67-degree head angle. Man, that weight though cannot be overstated how light that is. It doesn't quite have the exhilaration or excitement of my rocker. We'll see if I get used to it and click with it in a minute. With a little more time on it. I like that I can get a bigger dropper on that rocker. And even though this bike's 2 pounds lighter than my rocker, I don't know that I'd be all that faster in an XC race, except for that fork lockout. This is more my flavor with this shorter stem. But you're still not gonna get over the fact that it rides like an XC race bike. It pretty much wants to stay glued on the ground. I don't feel nearly as stretched out, but man, it'll still accelerate really well. Yeah, manuals are not its forte. Big surprise, this isn't a dirt jumper. The front end of this bike feels so light. That Lefty Ocho is really special. Not quite as plush as my Stepcast 34s, but it's every bit as torsionally stiff, probably more stiff. And it's a little racier feeling. It's a great fork. I'd love to hang on to this fork and run it on more of my builds. That'd be really fun. I'm so glad they've adopted a slacker head angle. I don't feel like it holds it back anywhere. And it's still got a long offset Ocho, so it's not gonna feel super slacked out and lazy at all. Even with the riser stem and the shorter stem, it has that forward centered position still, where the front wheel is plenty weighted. I prefer this. I think a 50 to 60 mil stem would be the ticket for me. So glad I swapped out these tires. This thing dares you to not touch the brakes. Really cool how composed XC race bikes have gotten. It's a joy to ride though on the right trail. There's no way I'd want to take this on a black diamond. This does not descend nearly as aggressively as 90% of the bikes I ride on the channel. Even my Spot rocker charges harder than this on the downs. Frame feels good though. They did a really good job balancing pedaling stiffness and efficiency with it not beating you up. Impressive, Cannondale. Yeah, I ride this a little faster on my spot for some reason. Still, this is impressive. It holds momentum extremely well. This stem does put your body in more of a trail-oriented position. I don't feel nearly as hunched over or stretched out, but it didn't really change the nature of the bike a whole lot. It's still got that kind of lightweight, skittish feel to it, where it just wants to sprint everywhere. It doesn't feel solid and planted, it just kind of wants to skip over the top of everything, which is what you want in a race bike. But I think it's a little racier than I would want for an everyday trail bike. I'm sure it is. And you know what? I think that's good, because this is designed to do one thing well, win races. And I'm glad they didn't compromise that to make it a better trail bike. It's a pretty quiet frame. Getting a little bit of that cable rattle from the dropper cable in there because it's not tube and tube construction. It's a little bit of a bummer. It's so weird riding a bike this light and pushing it on the downhills. A little bit unnerving. It just wants to bounce and deflect a little more than heavier, more planted bikes. I do think there is such a thing as too light of a bike for certain types of riding. Yeah, you definitely feel its lightness. Despite having the same geo essentially as the rocker feels more planted for some reason. Oh, what a joy though. I think racers are gonna fall in love with this thing. All right, back up that same climb. I'm able to throw my body around a little more with this shorter stem. I prefer that shorter stem on techie climbs. On long, smooth climbs, my back gets tired, but I think once I got used to that and conditioned my back a little more, I'd like the longer stem for XC race climbs. I've got to applaud Cannondale for embracing a modern head angle. I'm never wishing for a steeper head angle. Still charges uphill. It's interesting, some bike companies change one or two things to make them modern, like just the head angle or just the stem length, and others change everything. I feel like some parts of this are still old school, like the 175 cranks, super long stem, slacker seat angle, and some parts are super modern, like the tire clearance. I feel like this Lefty Ocho is amazing technology. The weight's incredible. Head angle's really modern. I wouldn't want it any slacker or any steeper. I feel like it's just right. Build spec is top notch on this. I don't know what I'd change. Nothing. It all feels good. The hub's not super high engagement, but it's fine, especially for how this bike's intended to be ridden. Yeah, no components stand out to you. You just forget about them and ride the bike. Really great build. This has been such a fun experiment, and what a special bike. If this bike were a car, it'd be a Subaru WRX STI lowered with a roll cage and race bucket seats in it. It would be purpose built for road racing, and it would be so fun at that. It'd be a little bit inconvenient to go get groceries in, and sure, you could lift it and put tires on it, but it's never gonna be a Toyota Tacoma in that factor. It's always gonna be a WRX STI at its heart, no matter what you do to it. And I feel like that's how this Scalpel HT is. You can take the Scalpel HT out of the racetrack, but you can't take the XC race out of the Scalpel HT. No matter what heavy tires you put on, or riser bars, or dropper, whatever you do to this to try to make it more trail ready, it's always gonna have that XC heart to it, and it's always gonna wanna sprint and fly up things. And I think you're actually doing this bike a disservice to make it more trail ready than what I've done here. Yeah, throw a shorter stem on, throw some meaty tires on, maybe a dropper, and you'll have a fast, very fast climbing bike that descends pretty well. It doesn't descend as well as some of the heavier, more aggressive bikes, it's so light that it has this liveliness to it, even bordering on nervousness. And it's not out of control, like twitchy, like an old school race hardtail with its sketchy geo. It's just not quite as planted because it's so light. It wants to deflect off of things more than kind of track over them. I'm so glad they built the compliance into the seat stays so that the rear end's not too stiff, and that really helps it not feel too crazy. And that liveliness brings some excitement to the trail. If you live where there's only flat stuff, or you're pedaling 90% of your trail just to keep momentum through stuff, man, this bike would be perfect for you. If you're the winch and plummet type who climbs for 2 hours and then turns around for a 30-minute descent, this isn't the bike I would recommend for that. This bike comes alive where single speeds come alive. It comes alive on racetracks. It comes alive on flowy, pedally stuff where you're just, between 15 and 20 miles an hour, just hammering it the whole time. I think Northern California, this bike would be an absolute riot, like you guys out in Auburn and Granite Bay and Wilder Ranch and Santa Cruz. I think some of Utah's stuff would be super fun on this stuff. Bryan Head, Park City, just pedally XC stuff. This thing would be an absolute joy. If you live for descents where pedaling doesn't do a whole lot and you can't pedal because it's so technical, you're going to find this bike's in a little bit over its head. And that's to be expected. This thing is meant to win XC races. I can't say that too many times because it rides like that. It is not meant to be a great all-rounder, or you throw a DHF on this, it's not going to just magically make it an enduro bike or even a bike that wants to fly downhill that's still light. It's always going to be an XC race bike at heart, no matter what you do to it. And I don't exactly know what about it makes it that way. It could be the super light fork. It could be the longer chainstay. It could just be the longer seat tube, and the riding position could be that longer offset fork. It does what it does extremely well. But I think if you're trying to pull this into trail or all mountain territory, you're asking too much for it. And it'd be better off starting with a Toyota Tacoma pickup truck rather than lifting your STI and throwing big tires on it and making it slow and not really good at anything. I feel like this bike is more suited for XC racing than even the Spot Rocker, but I feel like the Spot Rocker is a little bit more exciting and energetic on everyday trails, and it's definitely the trail bike I would prefer. And it's weird because they have similar geo, but they ride completely different. That just goes to show how different hardtails are these days. So many people write me and say, "Oh, I think you're full of it because all hardtails ride the same." They couldn't be more wrong. Hardtails ride so different from model to model, and I love testing them and I love sharing my opinions with you. If you want to get nerdier and go deeper and analyze bike A to bike B or pick my brain on all the bikes that I've ridden, I have a bike consultation service and I'll link to it below in the description. I'd be happy to help you over there. That's how I support my family and put food on the table and keep this channel going. If that's not for you, feel free to keep enjoying these free videos, but make sure to like them and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss another review in the future. Let's go over the spec real quick. I'm absolutely in love with that Lefty Ocho. I'd love to try it in 120 mode, and I'd probably remove the lockout on it for me, but if I were racing, I'd definitely keep the lockout. It definitely gave it a peppier, livelier, sprintier feel, more than I've ever experienced on any other bike with a lockout. And it's real easy to hit that lockout. But if you have a dropper, there's now 3 thumb levers on your left. That's a lot. So I'd probably pick if you want a rigid post with the lockout up front, or if you want to ditch the locker and run a dropper, more of a trail setup. That's how I would do it. I like the shorter stem. Like I said, a 50 mil would probably be right on the money, 50 or 60 mil. I'd be curious to try a short offset Lefty Ocho, which they don't make, but I think that would make this feel even more planted on the downhill. I want to give a huge shout out to P&W Components for sending in this Rainier post so we could test this Cannondale Scalpel HT with a dropper. That really gave me the confidence to be able to push this bike on these trails. And I love that they're making droppers for these smaller 27.2 seat tubes. So even though this is dropper compatible, I don't feel like it was really meant for one. You can, but you can only insert it halfway through the seat tube because it hits this mount. Since this is carbon, I wish they'd stood that off a little bit to be able to run the dropper a little bit lower. I don't think most people are going to be able to fit more than a 120 mil dropper on there anyway, which for an XC bike is fine. I do hear some cable rattle in there. I wish it was tube and tube, but it's not the end of the world. I'd probably pull the bottom bracket out and shove some foam in there and shove some foam in the head tube just to tighten it up and keep it from rattling around. I really like the flex seat stays. They felt wonderful. And I didn't mind the 34 tooth with the 175 mil cranks very much. I got used to it real fast. If it was my trail bike, I'd drop them down to 170s, I think. But since this is so light, you can push a harder gear, a bigger chain ring, and not notice it. And it just accelerates like you're on a 32 tooth. Pretty amazing. Drivetrain felt good. That XTR derailleur felt great. I love that Lefty, and that front hub's cool. I'm glad I upgraded the tires, and I'm really glad I put a dropper on this. I would not be able to ride it half this rowdy with a rigid post. If I were racing, there are some courses I'd leave a rigid post on, but for everyday riding, dropper all the way. Thanks for watching, everybody. There's a party in the mountains, and you're invited.